Okay, so I would like to say welcome to this Innoasis Science Talk. My name is Anders Riel Müller, and I'm leading the Smart City Research Network at the University of Stavanger. And Innoasis Science Talk is a collaboration between the Smart City Research Network, the Future Energy Hub at the University of Stavanger, and Nordic Edge Innoasis. And today we have a, I think, really interesting talk with Leslie Kern, who wrote Feminist City, and we have a really very competent panel consisting of Ole from below and Sara from Collective Pulses in Barcelona, but you're actually in Vancouver right now, and Henriette Nielsen from the Norwegian Association of Disabled. So I think what we will do now is I will introduce the panelists like very briefly, and then yeah, I forgot to mention that this is actually co-organized with the Center for Gender Studies. So this is why Lin Meng, who's head of the center, is here, and she will introduce Leslie and the center after I just present briefly the panelists. So I'll just go ahead and present the panel, and I will start with Henriette Nielsen, who is a central board member of the Norwegian Association of Disabled. The Norwegian Association of Disabled is an advocacy organization of and for people with disabilities. Their vision is a society for all, where people with disabilities have equal opportunities to live according to their own wishes, abilities, and interests. In addition to this, Henriette studies community planning and communication at the University of Agder. I think actually you went into a master's program, so you're a little bit further now. Our second panelist is Sara Ortiz Escalante from the Feminist Collective Pulses. She's an urban planner who received her PhD in planning from the University of British Columbia. And she did her dissertation on planning the everyday, every night, a feminist participatory action research with women night shift workers. So Collective Pulses, they're based in Barcelona and has more than 15 years of experience working nationally and internationally. And you work mostly with urban planning and architecture projects through participatory processes, capacity building, teaching, and research. Our final panelist is Ole Pedersen, who is a social entrepreneur who is running his own social enterprise here in Norway called From Below, or Nedenfra in Norwegian. From Below aims at creating opportunities for and enhancing democratic participation in urban development. Ole has an evolutionary approach to urban development, and his work is focused on local context, but also keeping an eye on what's going on in Europe and internationally. He is behind the Tøyen Boligkonference, which is a Tøyen festival in 2020 that puts cooperative and collaborative housing on the Norwegian public agenda. He's also been a driving force establishing Tøyen Boligbyggelag, or Tøyen Housing Construction Cooperative. And Ole holds an interdisciplinary master degree in innovation from ESST, Society, Science and Technology in Europe. So with that, I would like to leave the word to Lina Meng for presenting the Center for Gender Studies, and Leslie.
Yes, thank you, Anders, and hello, everyone. My name is Lin Meng, and I'm professor of gender studies at the University of Stavanger. And we're very pleased, the center is very pleased to co-organize this event today with Nordic Edge and Research Network for Smart Sustainable Cities. I also want to thank you, the panelists, for joining us, and all of you who have signed up to be here. So just a few words about the center, which is a small but active unit here at the university. We have a total of 9 researchers and PhD candidates at the moment. In addition to our research, we offer 4 courses in gender studies each year. These are combined bachelor and master courses. And from next year, we will also have 2 PhD courses to offer. So we are very proud of that. If you're interested in following our activities, you can check out our website. We also have accounts on social media, and we also have a newsletter in English, and I think I'll share the link to that in the chat before we end today. So you're always welcome to reach out to us. But most importantly, I'm here because I have the honor of introducing Dr. Leslie Kern, who holds a PhD in Women's Studies from York University in Canada. Currently, Leslie is an Associate Professor of Geography and Environment and Director of Women's and Gender Studies at Mount Allison University. Leslie has published 2 books, most recently Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World by Verso Books in 2019. Over the years, Leslie has published extensively on gender, gentrification, and feminism, including articles on how the cultivation of joy in academia is part of a feminist practices. As an academic myself who's prone to pessimism, let me just say how much I appreciate this perspective from Leslie and her colleagues. I warmly recommend Leslie's scholarship. So now over to you, Leslie. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the co-organizers of this event for inviting me to share with you today. And I'm really looking forward to what the panelists have to say as well after my talk. Let me pull up the talk. So this morning, morning for me, I'm joining you from what is currently known as the town of Sackville, New Brunswick, Canada, which rests on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq and Indigenous peoples, Mi'kmaq and Maliseet Indigenous peoples with whom we are guided by treaties of peace and friendship. The book that Lina mentioned, Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World, was obviously written a couple of years ago now. When I first wrote it, it came out in Canada about a year ago this month. And of course, the pandemic has really brought an entirely new lens to some of the issues that I raised in the book. So it's been quite exciting to be able to have so many conversations about issues surrounding the idea of a feminist city, a more equitable and sustainable city. Not that the pandemic has been fun, but that it has certainly been a moment where there's a lot of opportunity for pushing forward some of these concerns, and a whole new set of people, I think, who are interested in these questions because of both the changes in their own lives and the things that they're witnessing in their communities and their cities. So Anders had asked me to just say a little bit about the book. So I'll just mention that when I wrote the book, it's designed to be accessible to a wider audience. So it's not meant to be just a book for other academics or even just for practitioners, but really for anybody who lives in cities, who loves cities, who cares about cities, and wants to think about ways in which they could be more equitable places. And I attempted to use everyday experience, primarily my own, but also drawing on kind of firsthand accounts of other people in the city to bring a sort of an embodied personal lens as a starting place for asking certain questions about the city and opening up the discussion from there. And part of my goal was to think about denaturalizing the built environment. So we're very used to maybe not paying that much attention to the built environment in terms of what it means from the perspective of social relations. It's just this edifice that's kind of always been there. It's been there before us. It will be there after us. And we might not stop to think very often about the why of why things are shaped this way, why we move around the city in certain ways, why places are designed in some ways and not other ways. And we certainly might not be accustomed to asking questions like, is this design process gendered? Is it racialized? Is it, what assumptions is it making about the kinds of bodies that are moving through these spaces? So the book was meant to help people to kind of see the built environment in new ways, to not think of it as just this sort of background stage where social relations might happen, but to see it also as an active participant in all sorts of social relations. And the other aim of the book was to try to bring an intersectional lens to this sort of problematic of the feminist city. So my goal is not to simply replace a presumed able-bodied white male figure with a similar figure, but in a female body, but to think through the different ways that even some feminist approaches have not necessarily been advantageous for other groups in the city, and may in fact increase levels of violence, over policing, stigmatization of other groups in the city. So to me, an intersectional feminist approach is one that asks us to kind of step outside of our own privilege, to be aware of our own privilege, but also to try to bring in a variety of different voices and perspectives that question even some of the sort of tenets of core ideas of feminism. So that's a little bit of an overview of the book. I'll note that, you know, I'm not a planner or an architect, so the book is definitely not a blueprint. It's not a master plan for a feminist city, but it's maybe a set of values around which we could think about shaping our cities and our relationships within them. So my goal today in sharing with you is to encourage ways of thinking about cities that combine principles of equity, sustainability, justice, and care. So one of the ways to frame this discussion is to think about some of the things that the COVID crisis has really laid bare for many of us. So we've seen in many places, even those of us who are privileged enough to live in countries with fairly good social safety nets, that those nets they have some bigger holes than many people had assumed that they have, and that we are questioning whether our systems can really carry us through a crisis. So we've seen a lot of gaps in those systems, particularly with respect to things like care and the safety of elderly people in our communities, disabled people in our communities. And we know that the COVID crisis has laying a lot of extra work on the shoulders of women who still do the primary amount of caregiving work. And this has all sorts of ripple effects through, you know, families and communities, but also through this bigger thing that we call, you know, the economy. So it raises questions for us about who and what have we been relying on in these so-called normal times, right? Whose labor keeps the system functioning, whose labor patches those holes in our social safety nets on a day-to-day basis. Is it the unpaid labor of women in the home? Yes. Is it the underpaid labor of women, racial minorities, recent immigrants in our communities who are doing the devalued, stigmatized, low-paid, de-skilled work that all of a sudden during the crisis we discovered was essential work that actually is the kind of work that keeps us alive and fed and clean and cared for. And, you know, is it sustainable to rely on this system of essentially exploitative, unpaid and underpaid labor? And I think many of us many of us have known this for a long time, but it's becoming part of discourse now that we can discuss, you know, this is very shaky. It's a very shaky system. This is a sustainability question. And then another question is sort of what assumptions have long been underpinning these systems, or sort of forming the basis that allows us as a society to say, this is how things just work, or this is how they should work, or this has been fine for so long. So what are some of those, you know, gender-based assumptions? What are our racialized assumptions? What are our class-based assumptions? What are our kind of moral and value judgment assumptions that, you know, this system rests upon? So those are just a few kind of framing questions that the COVID crisis might raise for us. So as people interested in questions about cities, the idea of a smart city, a sustainable city, an equitable city, what are some of the questions that we can ask ourselves in this context. So one of them would be to question what values are hidden underneath the surface of many of our urban ideals. And I raise this question kind of no matter what group of urbanists I'm talking to, whether it's people who are planners, whether it's people who have sort of, I don't know, an idea of the smart city at their forefront, or an idea of a green city, because we all have a set of values, norms, assumptions, biases that we carry with us, some of which we might be aware of, but many of which we carry somewhat unconsciously. And of course, they then get reproduced in notions of what we consider to be, for example, a beautiful place, a fun place, a comfortable place, a safe place. So all of those ideas are really heavily value-laden, norm-laden ideas. And it behooves us as people who are intervening in cities in some ways to really question what some of those deeper ideals are that are kind of lying just underneath the surface. One way to do that, and this is sort of a classic, feminist approach, is to think about binaries, to ask what sort of dualisms or oppositional thinking do we have built into the ways that we imagine our spaces in our society. So feminists always like to point out binaries. Sometimes we want to flip binaries, sometimes we want to explode them, but definitely it's always a question that we're asking. So I think as urbanists, we can also learn a lot from this as well. So I'm not going to talk about all of these. And this is not a complete list. This is just some of the ones that might first come to mind in thinking about the cities in terms of some of the binaries that shape how we imagine the spaces around us. So these could include things like the idea that home and work are separate spaces. This is certainly a binary that has been collapsed for many people during the pandemic as we've moved to a work from home situation, at least those of us who are privileged enough to be able to do that if our jobs allow that and our homes allow that. But it's not necessarily been an easy collapse. And it raises both questions about what is home supposed to be and what is work supposed to be. I put family and friends up here because there's a kind of a division between the idea that there is one, primary family unit around which that's sort of a basic building block of society, and all other kinship relations, whether they're friends or other sorts of relationships, are secondary, not as important, and don't really need to be built in to the city. And of course, something like public-private is a very deeply entrenched division. And again, I think the pandemic has really shown many people that not only is this division problematic, but it is not actually one that functions in most people's lives in ways that we might assume it does. So again, these are just some things that we could think about as urbanists, and the question might be, do we need to kind of disentangle these binaries? Do we need to think about why we've set them up in opposition to one another? Do we want to collapse them, explode them? Do we want to turn them into some other kind of relationship to one another? But at any rate, we want to at least be aware that they might be kind of structuring how we think about our cities. So what does it mean then to take this and kind of move forward to envisioning a more feminist city? And I say more because I don't know that there is some perfect utopian endpoint here, but that there is certainly a process that we can go through to imagine the feminist city. So what kinds of principles, values, and ideas might underlie this, and how do they help us address not only this crisis, but imagining and creating cities that will be more robust, more sustainable through all of the other current and future crises that are on our doorsteps. So the first one that I'll mention is the idea of margin to center. So I think often in planning, and Sarah can perhaps back me up on this later, there's an idea that we have to design for the majority, and who we imagine this majority to be, I want to suggest, is maybe actually a minority. So the idea of a sort of an able-bodied, economically productive in a traditional way, working age citizen as the majority as the center that we're supposed to be designing for and thinking about cities. This group is perhaps not actually as big a group as we think it is when we consider all of the other people who tend to be considered part of a niche or a marginal group, whether those are disabled people, the elderly, families with young children, recent immigrants, racial minorities, that if we take all of those groups together, and especially if we were to add in women as a sort of a niche or special interest group, that's the majority, right? So I think one thing we could imagine is what if we kind of explode the idea of the center and imagine designing for what has previously been considered the margins. I think we would in fact find out that in doing that, we are designing in the most inclusive, sustainable way possible, because we would be designing cities and spaces that support a much wider variety of human relationships, both social relationships and economic relationships. Again, probably should collapse that binary as well, and not be leaving what is probably in fact a majority of people kind of out in the cold when we think about all sorts of issues, whether that's mobility, getting to work, care, and so on. The second one I'll point out is that the symbolic matters, and I think this has been driven home to us over this past summer with things like the Black Lives Matter protests that led to a kind of widespread movement to topple statues, such as the image here of the statue of Colston being a slave owner being toppled in Bristol in the UK. And a potent reminder to us that the images that we use in places, the naming practices that we use, the markers, the stories that we tell, actually do matter to people in terms of questions of inclusivity, because they communicate a message of either you belong here or you don't, or you're valued or you are not, or your history matters or it does not. So the symbolic is not everything, but it does matter. And we don't want to kind of discard questions of the symbolic too quickly when we think about space. So some of the other images here, a statue commemorating the use of comfort women during the war. And in fact, if you just Google like statues of women, it becomes apparent that around the world, while there are many statues of like a female figure, there's not that many statues of actual known women. It's still a relative rarity to have monuments to real women. And the last image is one from my hometown, the city of Toronto, where many place names, such as street name markers, are now incorporating Indigenous versions of those names in order to pay respect to the ongoing Indigenous presence in those places. All right, my third principle, this idea of kind of turning the home inside out. So given that something like the pandemic has really reminded us how much care labor is sort of deliberately, I think, made invisible in the home, relies on a kind of, gender binary and naturalization of care work as women's work or as undervalued, unskilled work that we can pay people very little to do or nothing at all to do, that one of the things that a sustainable city might want to think about is how can we kind of turn some of that labor and make it public, bring it into public space and collectivize it in different ways. So whether that's thinking about how we provide food in our public parks, for example, how we can have communal cooking and care spaces, how we can bring children out into the community, whether that's for schooling and education or to participate in different sorts of community building projects. These are all ways in which we might think about designing spaces that don't rely on all this care labor just being tucked away in the home, but they make it visible and they can make it shared. Another principle would be to start from the body. So I guess I'll just make the incredibly obvious and yet not obvious in much of urbanism statement that people have bodies. People have different bodies, and a lot of our urban spaces and even our buildings don't really seem to take this into account. And in fact, it seems like a lot of planners and architects find having to provide for bodily needs to be like a kind of a bug in their design, right? Something that interrupts the clean lines of their building or is an eyesore in their public park if you have to put a toilet in there or rest spaces. But if we start from the idea that we all have certain embodied needs for rest, shade, shelter, water, food, bathroom use, then we might imagine what do public spaces look like that begin from those embodied needs. And to me, this is also obviously about accessibility, physical accessibility for different groups of people, but we can imagine that quite broadly. So that can include the accessibility to a bathroom that matches your gender identity, that can include accessibility to spaces for the elderly, as well as, of course, disabled people, ensuring that the widest possible version of the public is able to use public space, because of course many people avoid public space because their very basic bodily needs cannot be met in many public spaces. And we're seeing this right now, kind of looking again at my hometown of Toronto, and probably similar for maybe where many of you live in a colder climate. A lot of our public spaces, their facilities shut down in the winter or even now in the late fall. So things like public washrooms are already closed in parks because they're not heated spaces. And in a time of a pandemic where we're supposed to be outside as much as possible to socialize, this is obviously just a very basic thing that's going to make it impossible for many people to do that. So we got to start from the body. Putting care at the center. So this is kind of similar to thinking about turning the home inside out, but I think we have to think about the kind of the work of care of ourselves and others as quite central to city building instead of an afterthought. So instead of imagining our cities as needing to be set up the most efficiently to get someone to and from their place of work and their formal economic activities, what about if we foregrounded the care work that has to happen? Again, how we feed people, how people take care of children and the elderly, how we provide for people's basic needs. And in the top image, you see a man trying to change a child just on a concrete sidewalk, presumably because either there's no public washroom or because he's a man, there's no childcare changing station in his washroom, right? So thinking more broadly about what does it mean to have a city that recognizes that care work happens in the city and needs to be made kind of as accessible to all as possible. And the final sort of principle that I'll raise is obviously inspired by the work of Black Lives Matter and many groups who came before them, to think about safety in a different way. And as we imagine public spaces, especially going forward into a kind of an era where we might need to think about how we use public space in more radical ways in the context of something like a pandemic, can we imagine safety outside of traditional policing or private security? So can we imagine the idea, reviving Jane Jacobs' idea of eyes on the street, by which she didn't mean CCTV, right, or cameras or people spying on each other or reporting each other on Nextdoor app or something like that, but she meant a community where people know one another, notice one another, are looking out for each other, and are not invested in kind of snitching on one another to their like COVID snitch line or whatever it might be, or calling the police on one another, but who are invested in a sense of caring for one another. So I think we do have to take really seriously calls to defund the police, prison abolition, as also part of an urban agenda that is a much more radically inclusive agenda. So to conclude then, some of the final questions or thoughts that I'll leave you with, is this a moment, a pandemic moment, where the sort of crisis around care work, again, who we rely on, what kind of work we rely on to keep our systems functioning, will it finally be seen as an urban crisis, as a sustainability crisis, instead of just like a women's problem, for example? Will it actually be seen as something that is crucial for us to understand if we want to create these sort of robust social systems that can carry us through all of the crises, climate crises, economic crises, and health crises that we are facing? And of course, this question of can there be a kind of an environmental sustainability or an economic sustainability without a vision of justice at its core? I think it's probably pretty obvious where my answer would lie. And I suspect that if you're on this call today, you probably generally would agree with this point. But I would say, this is a critical moment for placemakers, urbanists of all kinds to push forward an agenda that includes justice as part of a broad vision of sustainability, to question some of the things that we've taken for granted about our cities, and to incite ourselves and others to think from a place that turns some of our assumptions inside out and upside down, or maybe even blows them up altogether. So thank you very much for letting me share these remarks with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. That was really interesting. I think we will just go right over to the panelists. So we will start with Henriette, who will give a brief introduction of herself and organization and some thoughts on the presentation and Sarah's book, maybe. We'll see. Go ahead, Henriette.
Thank you. So my name is Sanette, and I'm really grateful to be invited to speak to you all. I'm a 30-year-old queer disabled activist, and I study human rights and multiculturalism at the university in southern Norway at the moment. So I have a body that functions a little bit differently than most people. So I can't walk. I use a wheelchair to get around. And this makes my everyday life somewhat challenging at times. Before COVID-19, I was always on the move. I work as a political advisor, and I have meetings all over Norway and Europe. And one of the most challenging things I find is that I'm always unsure on whether or not the city I'm visiting is accessible. Can I use public transportation? Can I get into the building I'm supposed to be going to? Can I use Google Maps to navigate the city, because the walking routes aren't necessarily accessible with a wheelchair? So that was one of the most challenging things with my work. So universal design is vital for me to have the freedom and equal opportunity as people walking on their 2 feet. For me, universal design means the design of products, environment, programs, and services to be used and be able to be used by everyone, without the need for adaptations or special designs. Universal design should not exclude assistive devices for particular groups like myself who need a wheelchair to move around, but it should facilitate it to be possible for me to use my wheelchair whenever I need. So when I'm speaking about disability, I'm using the social model on disability, and the social model on disability identifies systemic barriers, derogatory attitudes, and social exclusion, which makes it difficult or impossible for individuals with impairments to attain their full functioning. The social model on disability diverged quite dramatically from the medical model on disability, which has been the norm for quite some time. And that model says that it's my body that's the problem, not the environment. So all of the blame is placed on me, and I should just work harder to overcome my impairments. And it isn't possible for me to just work out 24/7 to be able to walk again. That's just not even a possibility. And by moving from a medical model on disability to a social model, it's easier for us to get human rights and be recognized as someone who has human rights, instead of just someone in need of charity and assistance. As a simple example, if a person is unable to walk stairs, the medical focus is on making me able to walk the stairs, and the social model tries to make the stair climbing unnecessary by replacing it with a ramp or similar type of assistive thing. So it could be an elevator. So moving forward, I think, as Leslie was talking about, intersectionality would be crucial, because all of the different minorities make up the majority in total. As a queer woman, I see that I have challenges. As a disabled woman, I have challenges accessing the city. And in total, this makes sometimes the city a challenging and scary place for me. I just want to highlight some key aspects when it comes to development moving forward, because the Sustainable Development Goals has a motto that says, leave no one behind. And my fear is that we are leaving behind large groups of people who should have access to the city, and especially goal number 11, who says make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. The way we are developing cities and have been developing city does not include all people in the development. It's often a top-down approach to development instead of a bottom-up. So we are lacking the input from key groups. And when it comes to disability rights, I also want to highlight the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is a quite radical new approach to disability and disability inclusion and disability rights. And it is a international shift from the medical model to a more human rights-based approach. And we're seeing some of the same trends here at home, but it is moving slowly. So yeah, I just want to say thank you for being allowed to give some input based on Leslie's talk.
Thank you so much, Henriette, and we will get back to you in a minute when we start the panel debate, but I will take the next person on our panel, which is Sarah. Please go ahead.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and after hearing and listening to Leslie and also to Henriette, I'm just gonna use some slides to talk about who we are. We are Collective Punsis. We are a non-profit cooperative of sociologists, architects, and urban planners based in Barcelona, Spain. We've been working since 2005, more than 15 years now, to integrate and transform cities from a intersectional feminist perspective. And basically, we work through 4 pillars, some of the things that you have been listening already. We use an intersectional feminist perspective. And as Leslie and Henriette were saying, is that it's really important to understand how gender impacts the use and the right of people to the city, but this cannot be understood without understanding that the relation with the city of a woman, a man, or a non-binary person, a queer person, its impact and also related with other identity variables that oftentimes become oppressive too, like disabilities, racism, age, etc. So we try to integrate that in all the work that we do. The second pillar that we use is community participation, because one of our goals is also to de-hierarchize planning. And we really believe that the real experts of a community, of a neighborhood, are the people who inhabit those places, and not the planners and the architects that arrive to do the design and the transformation of these places. So I'll talk a little bit more about that and how we do it. We also incorporate the sustainability through the ecofeminist perspective, because as Leslie was mentioning, it's been already for decades that ecofeminists has said that we cannot understand the climate crisis without understanding the care crisis that we have worldwide, and above all in the global north, and but also depending on the global south workers, informal workers. So, and I think the pandemic has showed the necessity and have made even more visible that we already had a care crisis around the world. And finally, we work as a cooperative. We are a feminist and solidarity enterprise, part of the solidarity economy, and that's also how we translate it in these values in the way that we work. So as Anders has presented before, over these years we have worked in more than 100 cities and towns around the world, mostly in the context of Spanish-speaking countries in Catalonia, Spain, and Latin America, but also done some work in North America and Africa. And we do several things: architecture and urban planning, awareness raising, capacity building. We also do research, but one of the pillars that I think mainstream all these topics is community participation and community engagement. So the way that we approach our feminist urban planning is understanding that we should transform the cities that have been built based in a racist, capitalist, and patriarchal model of city. And we have to change priorities to place people's everyday life at the center of urban decisions. De-hierarchizing, as I said, but also depatriarchalizing spaces. Spaces are often too white, male-oriented in urban planning. And for that, we have developed this year's work under the paradigm of the city of care, where we match the kind of like the pillars of the ecofeminism, and also related with the nature and environment. Another pillar is that we really need to make spaces and cities safe for all and free of gender violence. One of the topics that has been more studied in feminist urban planning is how to make cities safer for women. It's been an issue that is direct consequences of that we still live in a very patriarchal society. So that's essential, and that's part also of all the process that we do. And also, as part of the community engagement, we believe that we have to plan based on women's everyday life experiences, because and acknowledging and making visible the knowledge and the expertise that we have, because we often have this double and triple shift, because we continue being the main caretakers around the world, spending twice as much time than men doing domestic work, and we are still the main caretakers. So we work in different topics, doing public spaces, service and facilities, mobility and transportation systems, also housing. And the way they do it, as I said before, is through community participation. So maybe after in the discussion, we can talk about how do we apply that. But basically, the work that we do is also focus in gathering information and qualitative data at different scales, acknowledging and changing gender power dynamics also in the participatory processes, to gather this part of information that has not been valued in urban planning policies, because oftentimes it's very focused on quantitative data. Decisions are made very focused in quantitative data. And now with the big data paradigm, this is also a risk and a danger that we have to be thinking about. And I think I'll stop here, and maybe I'll continue later with the debate.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah, and then we'll take Ole as the last panelist to introduce himself.
Hello, and thank you very much for this opportunity to join this discussion. I must admit I was a little bit surprised for the invitation, as I'm in no means an expert on feminism or the feminist city. Yeah, but that being said, and I'm very happy for this opportunity, and also I have been learning a little bit this last week about the feminist city from listening to the audiobook from Leslie that is available on Spotify. Not been coming through it all, but I've heard bits of it, and feel that I now understand these perspectives a little bit more than I did a week ago. But I also, and if I had known the work of Leslie Kern better before, when I got this invitation, I think in my presentation that I sent you also would have included that I've been part of a collective that had one pub and one club that was like queer spaces, queer venues for concerts and and other kinds of club events and other kinds of cultures. So I'm quite, so even if I'm no expert on feminism, I've been sort of engaging in and familiar with some of the relevant concepts. But I guess I was invited here to talk about because my field of work is within democratic participation in urban development, and I had a special focus on housing. And through this, through thinking and trying to understand the feminist city or urban feminism, I try to think about housing in such a perspective. And of course, I guess at least all over Europe, European cities, we're talking about the housing crisis now. And the housing crisis is due to market structures, market development, and the cost of housing. And when we know that even in Norway, which is supposedly or is known to be a quite equal country, related to in relation to gender and gender equality, and we know that women earn, I think it's 86 cents or 80 something cents per krone, like the Norwegian currency, that men earn. So of course, if you only earn 86% from what men earn, it also influences your access to the housing market. So of course, then women are have a lesser access to housing markets than what male has. And in Norway, we are now talking very much about what they call the nurse index. So the nurse index is a concept where they say how big proportion of the housing market are available for a single nurse with in 100% employment and a normal on a nurse salary. And in most Norwegian cities, this is around 20 to 30%. So okay, we could say that it's kind of fair for a single income to have access to a fifth, third of the housing market. But then in Oslo, a single nurse will have access to less than 3% of the housing available on the market. So of course, this means that it shows that housing is very hard accessible. And also, when Leslie talked about this, what are the important roles of professions we have seen? Of course, nurses are amongst them, but we also seen how bus drivers, the people who work in the general stores, and how all these people are. So suddenly we understand very clearly how they are essential workers. And then when we talk about accessibility to the city, we know, and now we also talk about the 10-minute city, that you should have access to the walkable city, the 10-minute city. You should have access to employment, to kindergarten, to schools, and to doctors, to all your basic needs within 10 minutes distance from your home. And then, of course, the 10-minute city, we need to ask, for whom should it be? Should it be for the people who wash the offices, or who are in the general store, or the teachers, the nurses? If we want the 10-minute city to be for them, we need to. The housing market doesn't provide that opportunity as it is. And I also enjoyed very much what Leslie said about sort of turning the homes inside out, and how to make this and how to make sort of community spaces and community functions of caretaking, making food. And these are also concepts we work with in the Tøyen Housing Construction Cooperative. We have not realized any housing projects as yet. We are only proposing project, but those kind of concepts are very much in line with how we work and our proposals. Yeah, but I guess I have not really been thinking about these concepts in sort of I've not been thinking about them as feminist perspectives before, but to think about it like that, I think gives it a new dimension and even elevates the relevance and the importance of such approaches. And yeah, I guess that could be it for my just introductory comment. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ole. I was wondering, Leslie, do you want to comment on some of the comments, or do you have anything to add, discuss?
Yes, well, thank you. I mean, there's so much from all of those presentations, but maybe I'll just say a tiny bit about this, about housing and the home, because as I've been, talking about the book or whatever, and people say, well, what's the biggest change? What's your biggest recommendation? And one of the things that I have to keep coming back to is around housing, because it's so central in so many ways to broader questions of gender equality but there's many aspects of it. So affordability is a huge part of that. There's also this question of safety. We know most of the violence that women face is in the home. And so especially during the pandemic, the idea that, well, everyone will just be in their home. Well, the home is not a safe space for many people. And so we've had to question, what do we mean by home, and for whom is this idea of home really accessible? And so the question is also one around safety. It's for me also one around, the home being still set up with the idea of a nuclear heterosexual patriarchal family at the center of it, and how kind of unsustainable that is, both in terms of the care work that has to go on in it. I think environmentally, it's very unsustainable to have us all in these little, units, all running our own washing machines and cooking for 2 people at a time. This is just not very environmentally sustainable. It's not climate friendly, and it's not people friendly. So how are we going to think going forward about different models of the home? This is also an accessibility question, both for disabled people and also for an aging society, where many of us, probably all of us, will have accessibility needs at some point in our lives. And rather than our current system in most places of just, well, we'll just hide elderly and disabled people away, and a pandemic's come and they're going to be the first people to die and we'll do nothing about it. This has certainly been the case in Canada, where most of our deaths have been in long-term care homes. Models of other kinds of models of community housing, accessible housing, intergenerational housing are going to be so important going forward. So we kind of can't underestimate the role of the home, but having to think broadly about what the home is so crucial.
Thank you. And I just want to say, Lina, if you have any questions to the panel, please also feel free to ask them. Yeah, so one of the questions I was actually interested in, and you've all touched on it, I think, is I think the basic premise that we can all agree on is that injustice is sort of built into the cities that we have today. It's basically designed into our cities, different kinds of injustice. But I was actually also thinking about what most of you have also mentioned is I think one thing that I would be interested in discussing is more this, from everyday experiences, we see more of the subtle ways that injustice are being perpetuated through the design of our cities. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about why is it so important to have these everyday experiences into planning and design processes? And I don't know if anybody wants to start.
I can start if you want. Well, it is what brings intersectionality and the diversity to the picture, because everyday life experiences are diverse. So working through the everyday life experiences, you can catch the knowledge, the expertise, the needs, and the problems and barriers that people live in their community and neighborhoods. So that's why it's essential, but also because thinking on everyday life terms means thinking beyond the productive sphere, the consumption sphere, and the capital sphere of the big work. So working on the everyday lives means to put people's lives at the center, and which means also make visible the unpaid care activities and place it also in the public, in the social sphere, as well as the other activities that allow a community to reproduce and survive, and people to survive, which is like the community sphere, all the activities that we do to take care of the community, to activism, volunteer activities, etc. But also the personal sphere, that oftentimes women don't have that personal sphere of self-care. So I think working with this through the everyday life is to make visible this care sphere, and also to advocate for making it a community and social responsibility, and not only women's responsibility, as it happens when we relegate that sphere to the home. And I'll be happy to share later an example about a project that we are doing to create a network of community care, also with this purpose, right? To take the care responsibility outside of the homes to the community and the public sphere.
Thank you. Henriette, did you have something? I could see you unmuted your phone. Ole or Leslie, do you have anything to add? No?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I would very much like to hear more about that community project you mentioned, Sarah. And of course, when I work and when I work with housing and housing projects, we have very much a community focus on it. And I'm sort of, for me personally at least, we are sort of a collective, a group, so other people may have thought about it, but and we are also a very like in the Kern housing construction cooperative. It's very female dominated, I guess I would say. I guess taking the board, we are 5 women, 3 men, or something like this. But Andrew talked about the community thing in feminist perspective, and now in this discussion, it sort of baffles me, because and I was about to ask, okay, how can we understand community work and in a feminist perspective? But when I was about to ask the question, I kind of think myself that it is because we take sort of the traditional women's understood to be women's choice as the food, the caretaking, and these kind of things, and say, okay, it's not an individual responsibility, but it's sort of a communal responsibility. And yeah, I guess maybe what I say now is quite obvious for those of you who are working with this, but for me, I just like to sort of say express that I very much appreciate to be able to discuss this line of thoughts together with you.
Yeah, I can see there's already some questions in the chat, but I think we'll take them at the end. I think one thing that I was interested in is, so there is a general agreement that we have to start from a bottom-up approach to urban planning and design. But what are some of the experience you've had when you, like, what kind of barriers does that kind of approach head into when you're trying to advocate for example, universal design or something in terms when you discuss with planners, with cities, and so on? Like, maybe we could discuss that, because I think that's something very interesting. Henriette, I can see you raised your hand.
Well, when it comes to barriers, the first one I would like to point out is just community meetings held in locations that's not even accessible. I was invited to give a speech about the importance of youth clubs and having those accessible, and they chose an inaccessible venue. And they chose to hold the meeting in a church venue also. So as a queer disabled woman, for the first, I couldn't go into the building. And secondly, I didn't feel safe because it was in a conservative Christian space. Run by the same people who have previously been quite aggressive towards me because I'm in the organizing community, queer organizing community. So just the spaces chosen for the bottoms up approach. And then also it's mostly a symbolic action, I feel, here in Norway, where we are invited in. Our messages are being written down, and then they are just put in trash afterwards, and we aren't being heard. And also, when we invite to these meetings, we don't have the cultural sensibility to actually think about how would ethnic minorities feel about going to these venues? Is there sign language interpretation? Are the pictures being shown being interpreted and explained so everyone has access to the information? A good friend of mine who's blind went to one of these events, and it was a 45-minute presentation consisting of 75 pictures in total, and they only interpreted one. And she was invited in to give her point of view on accessibility when it comes to being blind in a city and navigating the city. So there's just something about the way we plan and organize these bottom-up events, and the fact that it is planned by the bureaucracy instead of the activist groups and community organizing. So we need to think about the way and the structure and everything related to these events. Yeah.
I don't know if I can add to Henriette. Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I totally agree with Henriette what she's saying, and we experience in many community processes. And I think part of it is because not everybody bottom-up processes or community organizing is done through an intersectional feminist perspective. So some of the barriers that we encounter when that something comes from the institution is the time frame that they pose. They want things fast, and sometimes communities go fast because changes are a part of a long process or a midterm process. It's very important and essential not to impose the times of the administration to the community, because that's going to cause rejection. Also, the idea that doing bottom-up processes and participation needs to get, you need to get to a consensus. Getting to a consensus means also erase the diversity of the minority and the voices. So I think we have also to question that. Is it true that we have to get always to consensus? As Henry was saying, it's essential to adapt the methods to every group. For example, in our processes, when we do the needs assessment, we always work with separate groups. And people sometimes don't understand that, why we have a group for people with disabilities, another with elders, another with women, but everybody has different needs and different ways to participate. So it's important to respond to that and adapt to the methods. And that is essentially putting this intersectional perspective also to avoid what is happening many times in participatory arenas, which is mansplaining dynamics, where the voices that are taken into account are the ones that are able to speak louder and get more the microphone than the ones that prefer to participate in different ways. So the question is always to think who is not in these bottom-up processes, and what Henriette was saying also with people, racialized people in certain communities oftentimes don't feel appeal to participate in institutional-led processes. So that it's a question that we have to always to ask, as well to ask who are the gatekeepers of the community, and also being able to attract and integrate the diversity of the community in that process. And finally, to end, I think it's really important also to value again, and I want to emphasize that qualitative data that we get from bottom-up processes, because oftentimes even planners, they try all the time to quantify the qualitative, and qualitative analysis are different than quantitative analysis, because they provide you such a detailed and contextualized information, and that's something that needs to be acknowledged and implemented, because people are not numbers, are people.
Thank you so much. Do Ola or Leslie do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with all of that. I think communities often get the idea that planners and architects see community consultation as just like this hurdle that they have to jump over. It's just something that they're being forced to do. It's not something that they really want to do, and they want to kind of get it over with as quickly as possible. And so, you know, we see like just like a notice goes up, and oh, tonight, oh, and no childcare and no accessibility, and it's in this, you know, out of the way location, and what's the point anyways? Are they even going to listen to us? So, and then planners say, well, nobody came to the meeting. Well, because, you know, the meeting itself was woefully inadequate, and this is like an old story, right? This is not something that people are just observing now. So it really has to be a real paradigm shift in how we think about city building, placemaking, urban design, that it, you know, it has to slow down, and it has to really be willing to take the risk of what is a messier process of community engagement. It's not neat. It's not quantitative data. There is conflict. There, you know, is, you know, contradictory information. Like, but we have to at least try to engage in a different way, because the current model is not working for a majority of people.
Thanks. Ola, do you want to add anything or no? Okay. All right. So thank you so much. I think I had another question. I actually asked all of you to do a bit of homework. I sent you the news roadmap for smart and sustainable cities in Norway, and one thing I was interested in that is I think there's some interesting I think there's something interesting about like critically looking at like a concept like smart cities and what does that mean for justice. So I was wondering, any of you had any comments on it, or any thoughts about the way that they describe participation or the outcome of smart cities? What is it that we're actually trying to achieve? I don't know if any of you had a chance to look at it, but if you did, please go ahead and provide some comments. I can see Sarah, you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, maybe because we are in our writings, we are very critique to the smart city. Maybe let's try to do a constructive critique also based in the document that you are working. I think one of the fears of the smart city is also how it is like implemented in a context that perpetuates some dynamics and also some capitalist dynamics, and capitalism is totally tied up and married with the patriarchal system, right? So yeah, I think we have to be aware that sometimes trying to implement smart cities activities, there is a relationship with private interests and private business and companies that oftentimes, at least if talking about the context of Barcelona, the objective has been to have an economic benefit of that new technology. And at the end, the city has created new needs without covering basic needs. So for example, what meaning has to install electric chargers for cars in a city with like a very, very small percentage of people can afford to buy electric car. And is that like the model of sustainable transportation that we want to do? One, for example, in our city, 90% of people move walking or by public transportation, but we are not responding to the basic need that has been historical of building and having a public toilets network in the city, right? So I think these are the questions that it's important to raise when we are approaching the smart city for whom and for what purpose and who is going to benefit. And also not losing the perspective of the detail and the everyday life, I think is essential again. Yeah, I'm sometimes afraid of this paradigm that oftentimes is like very linked to the smart city, which is now the trend of the big data, right? That everybody wants to get big data, and also to whom we sell this big data, what we do with this big data, but also the way this big data is gathered doesn't show the diversity, the intersectionality that we are talking here today. And also in terms of bottom-up participation, oftentimes with the smart city, with the smart city projects that try to translate, and now with the COVID times, right, to translate everything to do like online participation or participation that has like a technology in the middle. So that technology has to be thought to serve people, right, and to improve people's life. But we cannot leave participation only to the online participation or to the participation through an app or through the individual participation. It's essential to maintain in-person and in-group participation, because it's where the debates and where the empathy builds in a community. So yeah, so these are my critiques, but I hope that they are read like in a more constructive way than in a more like negative way.
Thank you, Sarah. Henriette?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on smart cities. One is the emphasis on technology, because technology can be inclusive or it can be a limiting factor in the lives of many disabled people. And I'm thinking in particular about two groups of disabled people, people with psychosocial disabilities and people with cognitive disabilities. We have a large group of people with cognitive disabilities who doesn't even have access to smartphones or computers. So then building a new society based around technology where we lose the community feeling and in-person interaction, I don't think that's the most productive way to go. And I also feel, as Sarah was speaking about, the capitalist emphasis on a new society with the cooperation between public management and private enterprises. I see this as something that can limit the opportunity for ordinary people to participate in the future of the city. And also a city focusing on technology. Yes, it could be smart. However, new technology costs a lot of money. And it also has an environmental impact, especially when it comes to the CO2 production of the new technologies and the waste management of the new technology. Just using a simple example as wind turbines, how much garbage that in reality produces. So we need to think about smart cities, yes, but we also need to be critical and have a critical emphasis and focus on the new cities. It can't be just that the discourse and narrative is that smart cities are the way to go. It's the breaking ground and we are just praising it. We need to have the critical emphasis on it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Leslie.
Yeah, I was just going to add about I'm not even going to say potential, the actual use of new technologies as surveillance technologies, the way, I'll just speak from a Canadian experience. We've, uncovered through journalistic investigations and so on, the way that police forces have, without any, authorization or whatever, been quite content to take up new facial recognition technologies, to use data that has been gathered in contravention of policy or privacy laws by companies that have, later been found to be, illegally gathering this data, but the, police forces are quite content to use it until they're told not to. And even then, kind of still continuing to use it, but just not telling anybody about it. So I think we have to be really careful about, who owns this smart city data that's being collected by all of this technology? Who's going to be able to use it? Who's going to be able to kind of weaponize it in ways that, you know, contribute to ongoing over-policing and over-criminalization of certain groups in society?
Thanks. Ole, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I can because I think the Norwegian discourse on the smart city is sort of moving away from the tech focus and the big data focus, and are trying to discuss how is inhabitant or a people-centered smart city, what does that consist of? And I think the roadmap you from Daga that you asked yes to take a look at before this, I think that is a step in that direction, and it needs sort of to be read from like in relation to where the starting point is. And I think the starting point for smart cities were big data and a tech focus, and that they are shifting the discourse towards more people-centered and talking about co-creation, and also, you know, smart city is sort of one of these buzzwords as along with co-creation, co-production. But I think sort of the essence with the co-creation is that it's not only the public-private partnership, but it takes in the people, the inhabitants in that, and to have a functioning co-creation, it needs it's a power shift. You know, some of the actors, like the public actors and the corporate capital actors, they need to distribute their power, and it needs to be sort of a more level power field in order to have like a true co-creation, and to understand the smart city, sort of like how do we co-create more? How can we get the most potential out of the urban hive mind, so to say? I think that's interesting approach to the smart city, and I understand that you are a bit more critical to this approach from Doga, but I think they are shifting the discourse in the right direction at least.
Thank you so much, Ole. I think there is a general consensus here that even if we move forward with the smart city concept, it has to be with extreme caution. So I just wanted to open up for some questions from the audience. And I can see we already have one question, but if you have a question to the panel, could you just please write in the chat that you want to ask a question, and then I will say your name and then you can ask the question in person. But we have already one question from Heleg. Heleg, do you want to pose the question yourself?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. I just wrote it in the chat not to forget it. And first of all, thank you for a very interesting talk, Leslie. It's always, at least for me, that has more of a technological perspective towards buildings and cities. It's always very refreshing to hear new thoughts. So one thing that that came up, you mentioned that one way to create, in a way, more safer communities would be to, in a way, shift away from the police and private security and more towards people in the community actually taking care of the security. But then I see some potential pitfalls there. For example, how do we make sure that that does not lead to people, in a way, taking the law in their own hands and forming structures that has similarities to these vigilance committees that we really don't want? And are there any benefits of doing this shift compared to better training of the police? For example, I think of the difference between police training in the US versus Norway. Like in the US, where the extreme examples are, is it 10 weeks or so of training, compared to Norway, where it is at least 3 years, and the police doesn't carry weapons, compared to in the US, where they have semi-automatic weapons. So I just want to hear your reflection, and how do we avoid creating new problems making this shift?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'll just say that even with the current policing system, we already have vigilantism and that sort of thing. So I don't know that having the police would prevent that, because I think it actually accelerates that, because it creates this kind of widespread acceptance of policing culture. I'm not an expert on the kind of police abolition, but what I have seen, what I have learned from trying to listen to Black Lives Matter, for example, is when we think about police abolition, what we're talking about is this defunding of the police, but it's actually probably more useful to think about it in terms of a refunding of other sorts of things, right? So the idea is that if we could redistribute some of those billions of dollars, right, into everything from childcare to education to affordable housing to healthcare to mental health services, you name it, any number of those things, then you start to create the conditions of safety from the ground up, so that the kinds of things that kind of lead people into criminal behavior, like poverty-based criminal behavior and so on, are not there anymore, right? So that the idea is that if we build up safety from the sense of what makes people secure in their lives, right? Having a home, having a job, having a guaranteed basic income, having childcare, then so many of the things that come to, become crime are perhaps greatly lessened. So I think that's more of the vision, is that we would not perhaps end up with a sort of vigilantism, because ideally we would be greatly reducing all of the things that we call crime today. So it is a much more, radical vision of reshaping society along those lines. And I think in terms of, even questions of violence against women, policing, in my opinion, has done almost nothing to decrease violence against women. And something like affordable housing for women would probably be the greatest way to decrease something like domestic violence, because women would not be forced to be exposed to it in such great numbers. So yeah, thank you. I mean, there's so much more to be said on that question, but that's what I'll say for now. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you for the answer. Yeah.
I could see that Henriette had a comment, and also Ole had a comment. Henriette, go ahead.
One of the key things to remember, as Leslie was talking about, is the moving of funds from the police to other services. But I also want to highlight the community part of it, because the community knows its people. And in the US, at least, a lot of the people who are killed by police violence actually has a disability. It could be a psychosocial disability, a autism spectrum disorder, Down syndrome, and so on. And by the community knowing who has these kind of disabilities, it's easier to be able to manage the issues on a much lower conflict level compared to calling the police in at every moment. So instead, you might be able to call adult protective services, you might be able to call social workers, the healthcare system, instead of just the first call being to the police, who end up shooting people because of their disability.
Very good point. Thank you. Ole, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, thanks for both the question and for your inputs on this, Leslie and Henriette. And I have to say that what really got me curious about this talk was when I was trying to research, okay, who am I going to talk with? And I found Leslie on Twitter and saw her Twitter handle, and I've been sort of interesting to hear you say a little bit more about that. And thanks for that. Now, I'd just like to share a little story, or how to say it, from here, from where I work in Thailand. Like, I'm a social entrepreneur. My company is funded, or not funded, but it's in something called Thailand Limited, like we call it a neighborhood incubator. We have a library here in Thailand, which is very popular, but it used to have a problem with young male adults, around 20s or 16 to 20 something, who, in lack of other community spaces, third spaces to be in, they use the library as sort of their a place to hang out and meet. And as male youth in this age, it can be a bit rowdy and a bit loud. So the other visitors to the library felt sort of disturbed by their presence. So the library hired a security company to come there. They checked in every hour. It was quite a costly library, and checked in every hour, and was like, if these guys were there, they would toss them out and sort of make create conflicts. And then this local guy, one guy in the neighborhood who works within security, he was like, okay, maybe we could use this neighborhood incubator to set up a security company, so to call it. So he went there, talked to the guy, and said, okay, guys, want to set up a security company. Do you need work? Do you want to be employed in this security company? And they were like, yeah. So he hired them to work with security, and they sort of were the ones who were responsible for keeping the calm in the library. They got employment, that they saw opportunities to enter work, to get employment. So they both stabilized, or how to call it, the situation in the library, and he created job opportunities for the youth or the young adults who were sort of the cause of the conflicts. And so now they are called Ideal Security, and they're hired in to work both at other libraries in the city and and other events and places, but always with, okay, how can we create work opportunities for the people who, or the young adults who are looked upon as the problem from sort of the bigger community. So just thought that would be of relevant to how we can community watch our neighborhoods and public spaces.
Thank you so much, Ole, for that story. I can see we have a question from Bianca. Bianca, do you want to ask the question yourself?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Sarah. Thank you for woke up so early and talk to us. I am a master's student at the University of Stavanger. My master is in Energy, Environment, and Society. Now I'm writing the final pages of my master thesis, where I'm using intersectional lens to analyze the resilient strategy of Salvador in Brazil. And what my research has shown me now is that the city of Salvador is aware of the women's stress, but they need guidance, they need orientation on how to do this change. And my question is, how does the Collective 6 get in contact with the stakeholders to encourage this urban change?
Thank you, Bianca, for the question, and congratulations for your work in El Salvador, Bahia. So basically, we work as a nonprofit organization. We do work with institutions, and we do work with community organizations too. So oftentimes we are the bridge between the two. Sometimes we work in processes that come directly from the community, other times come from the institution. And I agree with you, and that's why we started to work 15 years ago. And I'll give you the example of why we started to, in the context in which we started to go, because that may resonate with why you feel that they are lost in the institution in Brazil. In 2005, the Catalan government enacted the first urban planning law in the country that included for the first time mandated to the municipalities in order to access neighborhood improvement plans funds. In order to access these funds, they have to apply a gender perspective in how they design the public spaces and facilities. So it was great because finally it was like enacted in a law that was mandatory. But then when it arrived to the municipalities, municipal planners didn't have any idea of how to apply a gender perspective in the way that they were developing the problems. So that was kind of triggering the work that started, for example, in that region. And we started to work a lot doing advice and consultancy work with municipalities, doing capacity building, accompanying them in some projects, etc. So it's important, as also I think Henriette has said before, that these processes might be led by the institution, but not facilitated by the institution. It's someone external that has to work between the community and the institution. And also because that can bring you some external knowledge that the institution doesn't have. And also for us, it's always very important the way that the process, the community engagement process is communicated and disseminated, and how we kind of like engage with participants, right? Because oftentimes institutions use like traditional channels of, I don't know, media. Well, they have started to use like social media, but even with the times of technology, it's very important to do this little communication, that is to talk directly with the community organizations, go invite them to the process, be in the street also, like in the middle of the day, telling about the process, talking with people, explaining the different characteristics, to invite them in their diversity of groups, but also at the individual level, how they can contribute to the process. I don't know if this answers your question, but
Yes, it's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any of you, Leslie or Ole or Henriette, anything to add to that? Okay. Well, I can see the time ran out already. It went very fast. But I think we had some, I think there were some very good things we can take away from this. I think, you know, first of all, that I think that justice should be at the center of how we do urban planning in present and the future. I also think we took away that, you know, taking participation seriously, not as something that just has to be done to sort of check off on your to-do list, but also to really, how can you say, to think about how do we do participation? How do we choose locations that are safe, accessible for the group that we are trying to include? Think carefully about what groups that we are unconsciously maybe excluding from taking part in the decision-making process. I also think you mentioned, you know, you have to have like different kinds of time frames for this. It's not something that can go very quickly necessarily. You have to allow people to sort of articulate their visions and their ideas and bring forth something, and have the opportunity to discuss with peers what kind of city they would like to live in. And then I also think there was this really good about the format of participation, like how does that address the particular groups you're trying to involve? Like, it should be accessible, it should be safe, it should be a place that people actually want to engage in. So I would like to say thank you to Leslie for the talk, and you should definitely go and buy her book and read it. And I also wanted to say thank you to the panel, to Henriette, to Sarah, and to Ole. It was really a pleasure to have you on the Innoasis Science Talk, and I hope we can collaborate in the future as well. So from here on, I would like to just one more thing. I just wanted to announce that our next Science Talk will take place on December 8th. And there will be an invitation online pretty soon. And it's called The Smart and Vulnerable Society, where we will discuss how this reliance on digitalization of our critical infrastructure, how that creates new challenges to how we think about safety in the cities. So with that said, I would like to say thank you again, and thank you to all the participants who joined. I hope you got something out of it. And so from here, thank you, and hope to see you next time. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
bye.
Bye.
Bye.